This is a story of something that my dad witnessed unfold when he was a kid in northern Texas. He was born and grew up on his family's farm until he was drafted to fight in Vietnam. And that neck of the woods, most of your neighbors' farms may be over 5 miles away. But the neighborly spirit of helpfulness meant all one had to do was ask and assistance will be given without a second thought. There was an exception to that rule. However, the two landowners located to the north of his family's place had been at war. Some said the Civil War one farmer had been a loyal Democrat and slave owner, while the other was supposedly the head of recently arrived Yankee family who was a supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the newly formed Republican Party. The Yankees were also wealthy and had purchased a large plot of land that the other farmer had his eyes on for some time. Like so many other families at that time, and in that part of Texas, what started off as a disagreement over politics, the coming war would only serve to worsen upon the end of that bloody conflict, and with the return of both men from fighting in it, those in the surrounding area hoped the differences between them would be squashed. But this was not to be the bitterness that had always been there, seething just below the surface would break free, and new after a dispute over a property line sprang up. Josiah Campbell, the patriarch of the pro-Union Campbell clan, had purchased a 500-acre piece of land just before the war had broken out. This large parcel adjoined to his neighbor to the east, Samuel Johnson's property, but it wasn't until 1883 when Campbell began to put in fencing to keep his neighbor's cattle from encroaching onto his land, did the already hostile relationship between the two landowners reach a new and dangerous boiling point. Multiple face-to-face confrontations would ultimately lead to a court battle in which Campbell would come out the victor. If Campbell believed the court's judgment would be the end of the argument between the two families, he would be proven terribly wrong. Many more disagreements, some of them over insignificant things, would arise in the following generations. One of the more notable involved Josiah now an octogenarian grandfather, in which a stray bullet would come very close to striking him. Although most in the area assumed Samuel or one of his sons fired the bullet, it could never be proven. And so then similar to this would only serve to keep the bad blood between the families just hot enough. My family's part in this drama is small, financially and politically. Our lot was similar to that of the Johnsons, a native Southern family arriving in Texas during the Republican period from Tennessee. However, that's where the similarities ended. From what has been passed down through the generations, Samuel Johnson and most of his offspring were ignorant and always looking for a fight. One specific story claims that my great-great-grandfather even stopped attending church because of them. Their attempt at avoiding any involvement in this whole mess was well fought, at least until a quiet morning in 1962 when they would be pulled into it, whether they liked it or not. It was a warm June morning. My dad and his family went to church like usual. Everything was normal that day except for the conspicuous absence of the Campbell family. The section they had been sitting in since the building of the church was glaringly empty. Because of this, mutterings quickly began to spread throughout the congregation. The Johnsons sat quietly in their own section, doing their best to ignore the rumblings around them. The Reverend waited but was eventually forced to go on with the service. On the drive home, the family passed the Campbell place expecting to see the bustle of the daily work and those involved in doing it. However, not a soul is seen in the house set, still showing no life within. My grandfather dropped the woman off of the house and he and my dad returned to the Campbell place to take a closer look around. As they approached the home, the uncomfortable silence was broken by the slamming of the screen door had been left open and free to swing in the wind. The noise brought out the livestock in their incessant moving, showed they had yet to be fed or milked. If this was truly the case, something had to be very wrong inside. My dad ran into the barn and fed them quickly and rejoined his dad at the door. They weren't able to enter with no problems. Unlocked doors were still a car. I'm in practice in those parts, but that would soon change. There were no signs of life in the back part of the house. My grandfather called out but received no answer. If anyone was still alive inside, the creaking of the stairs as they climbed them certainly would have caused them to stir, but no one appeared. The two men separated as they reached the landing, each heading for different closed doors. Just by chance, my father was the first to discover the fate of the Campbell clan, to small bodies laid still. In their little blood-soaked beds, John Jr. and William had been shot repeatedly as they slept. Upon taking in the sights, my dad rushed from the room, battling the urge to throw up. He was still just barely out of childhood himself, and he had to have witnessed something so horrible. His father was just about to enter the bedroom of the Campbell parents when his son came rushing from the room. Although no words were exchanged between the two, my grandfather knew what horrors the room behind him likely held. The scene in the parents' room was much like that of the children. Both elder Campbells laid motionless and bloody, in their large Victorian bed. They had both been shot with a shotgun to the head, but John Sr., the patriarch, had been shot several more times. So much so it was impossible to definitively identify him. Despite this, there was no doubt the heinously slaughtered man was indeed John Campbell. And the man behind the shotgun was his lifelong adversary Matthew Johnson. The ill-tempered Matthew's absence from this morning service was almost as noticeable as that of the Campbells. The manhunt that followed didn't last long. Matthew's body was found hanging in the loft to the barn, and it was clear that he took his own life. The motive behind the terrible act more than likely was the latest in their long string of court battles. This time the Campbells found it necessary to bring Matthew into another expansive and drawn-out case over the water rights along the long-disputed property line the two families shared. After more than 3 years of fighting, the Johnsons would ultimately come up on the short end of the stick. What would have been just another link in the chain that had connected the two farm dynasties for over 100 years, proved to be the end of the Johnson family's hold on their land. It was later discovered that they had been barely managing to keep their heads above water from harvest to harvest, and John Campbell's suit and their eventual loss was the final blow. Once Matthew no longer had anything left to lose. The century-old bitterness between the neighboring families broke free, and gave him the justification many of those before him lacked. His family told the sheriff all she claimed she knew her husband and stepped out just after sundown, only to return 2 hours later with a substantial bit of blood on his shirt. She stood by their bedroom window and watched as he burned those same clothes. After he finished this, he came to bed and went to sleep like normal. However, the next morning when she awoke, Matthew was not in the bed next to her. She searched the farm, but he was nowhere to be found. The family went to church like normal because she feared their absence would cause people to talk. She swore she had no idea what her husband was going to do when he left that evening, or what he had done when he returned. It was clear he had done something dark, but his target wasn't known. The remaining members of the Johnson family held an auction for their few valuables and vacated the property soon after. Dad said that they were rumored to be living in Wichita Falls and Matthew's wife had remarried. But once he went off to war, they never heard anything else about them. The ownership of their former homestead and adjoining land was purchased by a big land company out of Fort Worth, who broke the land up into smaller parcels and sold it off to new buyers. As for the Campbell land, the place would sit empty for many years. The slaughter that took place inside tainting the value of an otherwise beautiful home. That land too would invariably be broken up and become a massive housing subdivision on the area, and all the remaining family farms were consumed by the nearby city. I've been living in a 2-bedroom house next to campus for 2 years. No girlfriend to speak of and incredibly lonely. So when Rachel moved in next door, I was praying for a shot. I was so lonely, in fact, her 10-year-old son didn't scare me off. Being a tall, buxom redhead made her my dream girl. I say girl, but she was 30, a woman and almost 8 years older than me. Hellos and how are yous were shared each morning, and I did my utmost to keep her from noticing how creepy and awkward I really was. The way in which I fumbled over my words, as embarrassing as it was, didn't drive her away. As the months compounded, her talks became more personal and I less nervous. Before I knew it, she had asked me to take her out and I agreed. I was still a poor student. But even with that, our dinner went well and we progressively drew closer and closer. Her son actually turned out to be a cool kid, and he and I would often play video games together. I did my best to not appear as if though I was trying to be a father to him. More of a friend really. The situation did cause me to wonder why his father wasn't in his life. The possibility of him being dead did enter my mind, and I thought if I asked, it may bring up unresolved issues. The truth would turn out to be far worse. Things really hit the fan when her ex-husband arrived and announced that her house wasn't there when he showed up, but the fight between the two clued me in. At the time I was just waking up and heard yelling coming from across the street. I peeked through the blinds in time to witness him hitting her across the head and body. This instance would be the first of many, and was the moment I knew what we had was over. Long ago, I learned the hard way to not and get involved in an argument between partners. If you're lucky, you get out unscathed. But if you try to be the hero, the effort rarely gets rewarded. Even if she would have asked for help, I probably wouldn't have done it, but she never did. In fact, for the remaining time, her and her son lived there. No words passed between the two of us. The ex would move in not long after and stayed until they moved out. A few times her and I would share a passing look. Her eyes projecting an era of regret and apology, but nothing became of it. I made the choice to move in just as she had many times more. I would witness the abuse, and at least once she knew I had no one was going to save her but herself. I did have one more brief conversation with her son. He let me know his father had returned home from jail and the whole family was about to move across town to a trailer park. This talk was probably more of a way to let me know what happened to them, a friendly goodbye. I thanked him and said a goodbye myself. They moved the next week, and that was last time I saw either of them. Despite the overwhelming feeling of loss I carry with me, the truth is she was always too good for me. And unconfident and shy boy was never a match for a beautiful young woman. At least that's what I tell myself. No matter how brief our time together was. It was the best of my life, and I pray nightly I'll feel that joy again. I had a female neighbor as a kid. Her family was a little odd. They do very unsafe things like chuck throwing stars at each other. Normally the star has never struck one of them. Except for this one time when the girl threw one of her younger brother and it stuck in the back of his forearm. It wasn't really deep, mind you, but it still was deep enough to not fall out when he moved the arm. Instead of freaking out like any sane 10-year-old would, he laughed and pulled the thing out. Rather than calling it quits for the day, he threw it back at her. For a while I thought it was because they were half Japanese. And that's just what they did. But as I grew up, I realized that they were just crazy people. When I was 16, the girl and I started messing around, not sure how it happened. One day I was hanging out their house and I realized I was attracted to her. Not long after we happened to be messing around with each other and she pinned me down and began kissing me. It was all uphill from there. Some days, we'd only touch one another's bodies, and some days it went all the way. We'd been doing our best to hide what we were doing. But one day her older brother found out and decided to torture me for it. I never could get a straight answer from her on how he found out. But he had, and that was all that mattered. When he first approached me and I lied, but he saw right through me. Next, I began apologizing, but he still said nothing. His silence was terrifying, but not as much as the knife he was holding in his hand. At that moment, I was standing roughly 10 feet away from him. I eventually ran out of things to say, and we just stared at each other. The long seconds started to get to me, and I yelled at him to say something. Instead, he smiled, raised his hand, and threw the knife at me. I instinctively cowered and covered my head, but it sailed above me and hit the wall. There was no way I was going to stick around and become a pincushion. So I fled across the living room. He kept up his silent treatment, it was clearly working. I stopped to turn to look and see where he was. I saw him bend over and pick up the knife. When he'd seen I'd stopped, he threw it again. I saw what he was about to do and ran out the front door of the house. I didn't stop this time until I was inside my own house. As I ran into our living room, my mom stopped me and asked why I was running. It wasn't the first time I'd come running into the house, but I must have been horrified looking. I very nearly blurted out, but remembered what had initiated the chase in the first place. Telling my mom anything about what I'd been doing, or even admitting I had those type of thoughts, scared me much more than having sharp things thrown at me. So I told her I was very thirsty, and was running into the kitchen to get a Coke. I'm not sure if she believed me, but let it go. And I slipped off to the kitchen. Later in the day, my playmate called me to come over, but I swore I never go over there again. As long as her brother was around. She didn't know what had happened till I explained it to her. I hoped she'd get mad about how I was treated. Instead, she changed the subject and said she'd come over to my house. It was a little hard and mess around in my place. My folks were always around. At least one of them was kind of mad. She didn't stick up for me, and obviously still shaken from nearly dying. But she was able to take my mind off of all of that rather easily. We took the opportunity to make up when my mom stepped out for a few things, and we continued messing around any chance we had. I did stick by my pledge, however. I didn't step one foot in her house for the remainder of my time living with my folks. College came around in a few years, and other than small visits, holidays, her and I never saw each other after I left. I did run into her older brother during one Thanksgiving. Even though we were both adults now, and many years had passed since our talk, the memory of it was still strong, and I expected him to chuck a knife at me, and he second. My next door neighbor was the best he could dream of. She worked nights, and when she was off rarely made a peep. Her little dog was a concern early on, but I would soon discover it was as quiet as its owner had been at the complex for a year when she told me she found a boyfriend and things were going well. After that, I saw her even less than before and was more than happy to sign another 12-month lease. Things proved to be too good to be true. However, barely a month into my second year, things began to change drastically next door. Loud arguments were often heard through the walls, and the dog reacted to these as badly as I did. The poor little guy barked his head off, while she and the new love of her life screamed at each other repeatedly. I did attempt to ignore the racket for a couple of weeks, but would finally lose my mind and begin banging on the wall. I was shocked that it worked, but only the first time. All the others after were ignored. This garbage went on for over 3 months, and after several visits from the cops, she showed up at my door to apologize. She claimed things were going well, just as she had told me prior, but after he moved in, his behavior changed. After that, it seems all they would do is fight. He could hit her during one, and she foolishly forgave him. He'd sworn it would never happen again. But it did, and she kicked them out. Her hope was that he'd move on to someone else. However, he soon appeared at her door out of the blue, begging her to take them back. The cops are called, and she filed a restraining order. That was almost a month ago, and she hoped he was gone for good. From what I could see and hear, things had gone back to the way they had been originally. I went back to living a peaceful life, and I assumed so had she. Considering we had opposite schedules, it wasn't strange for us to go weeks without seeing or hearing one another. And I was happy for it to stay that way. That something terrifying would happen one day as I returned from work. I pulled into the complex and turned to enter my section of the lot and was blocked by several cop cars and ambulance, as it was a surprising thing to see, but none of my business, I suppose. I found another spot to park and headed for my apartment. As I neared my place, I noticed my neighbor's door was wide open and cops were going in and out. After what she told me, I assumed her ex had showed up uninvited. Upon approaching our building, another officer stopped me and informed me the area was closed. I let him know I lived in the building and asked what had happened. They couldn't tell me, but if I waited for a detective to come out, he'd probably have some questions for me. The cop said something over his radio, and a minute later, a guy in a suit came out of the apartment and took me aside. He only had a few questions: if I'd seen anything in the like. As the seconds passed, I got increasingly nervous and begged him to tell me what was going on. He paused and said in the very serious voice that my neighbor had been found dead in her apartment earlier that day. My eyes had to have looked like saucers to him. I was completely shocked and wondered how I had noticed something so major. Before he could ask the question, I blurted out her ex's name. They were familiar with him, and I could tell from his demeanor, he was their main suspect. He handed me his card and let me go. I turned to walk away, but stopped a few steps later. What's going to happen to her dog? That is, the detective hesitated, and a sad look popped up on his face. The assailant appears to have killed him, sorry. I'm not sure why this angered me so much. Struck me as needless, I guess. The cops probably thought I was crazy, mumbling cuss words under my breath as I walked away. The following morning, I was browsing through the local paper online and came across a story about the murderer had explained that my neighbor was a week late on the rent and received the notice. When no reply came after 2 days, the manager visited the apartment personally. There was no answer, even after she knocked, so she let herself, then found the body. The detective was quoted as saying that they had yet to find her ex, and they believed that he had fled back to his original home in Lebanon. Not much information has come out since then. The ex-boyfriend is still unlocated in. No other suspects exist at this time. I've moved on to a different apartment complex now. But for the remainder of my time in that one, things went back to business as usual. 2 months before my lease was up, new tenants moved in. This was a young couple with a 5-year-old boy. The noise coming from them was endless. And I was overjoyed when the time came for me to move. In the place I'm now in is majority older couples, and the noise level is almost non-existent. As nice as things are at present, I don't believe I'll ever have a neighbor as good as her. Anytime I hear a bang on my ceiling or loud talking through the walls, I think back on her and how great of a woman and neighbor she was. I'm not sure of how common it was in your neck of the woods, but most people have discussed the subject with had at least one kid whose dad would beat his mom in his neighborhood. My friend Mike was that kid where I grew up. I can count at least a dozen times from memory that I saw his mom with a black eye or busted lip. Sometimes both. It was rare that Mike or his brother got knocked around. But if it did happen, the abuse was more in the form of hard spanking or whipping with a switch. I grew up in a rural area in the South in the 1980s. Some folks were just starting to take abuse seriously. But whether it was striking your child or your wife, most didn't want to get involved. You have to realize a lot of the old church people live by the spare the rod spoil the child motto, and many of them, among others in the community, still believed a woman didn't get hits unless they said something they shouldn't have. It was an odd time indeed. But many others in my community despise any form of abuse, and said so as often as they could. My parents were some of those, but let me play at Mike's house anyways. Let's see his dad every once in a while, and he seemed nice. He was quiet and not many words were exchanged between us, but I never saw any reason to be afraid of him, no matter what the adults around me told me. However, I did tend to be around later in the day after he had a few beers. Unfortunately, one day I would stay too long and see the man for who he truly was. That day, Mike and I had been playing a game on his Nintendo. I can't remember which one, but I got distracted and didn't notice the sun was going down. Back then, I could go anywhere in the neighborhood, as long as I was backed by dark. I had lost track of what I was doing in the next thing. I knew I was running late. Cell phones were not a common thing in those days, so my mom couldn't just pick one up and tell me to come home. I started to panic because I knew I'd be in trouble. I threw down the controller and said bye to Mike. When I got up to open the door, Mike's dad flung it open and asked me where I thought I was going. I told him that I was late and needed to get home. The entire time, I was respectful and even called him Mr. Hughes, like my parents had taught me to do when speaking to adults. He replied by saying that I was just a stupid little rat, because I was already there. The words were slurred as he said them and confused me. I looked over at Mike bewildered. His expression showed utter fear. I wasn't sure what to say, so I said nothing. I stared back at Mr. Hughes, hoping he was just playing a joke on me. His next words were, "What's wrong with you? Cat got your tongue." These were just as slurred, and he swayed as he said them. That's when I saw the beer in his hand, and I became very afraid. If I could have shrank in size and rode away, I would have, with the knowledge I had surrounding how he acted when drunk. I was sure I was about to be beaten for nothing. His eyes were very glassy, and he looked around, hoping for someone to speak, but we were too scared. "Well, if you're not going to talk to the old man, go outside and help the brother pick up stuff out of the yard." Instead of looking at Mike when he said this, he was turned toward me. I can only assume he mistook me for Mike. The real Mike was sitting just behind me on the floor, well within range, but I guess he was so drunk, Mike was invisible. Or maybe he was so used to seeing double. He thought that that was the case of that moment. I was about to correct him before I saw this as my way out. I did as he said, but rather than stop to help Mike's little brother, I booked it 3 houses down to my own, hid in my room. I got lucky that night. Neither of my parents heard me sneak in. And when they came to check on me, they assumed I had been in my room the entire time. After weighing the pros and cons of telling them about what had just occurred, I chose not to. It wouldn't have achieved anything other than putting more unneeded stress on Mike and his family. So I let it go, and kind of myself fortunate. I'm not sure what happened when I left. Mike never mentioned it. The situation did teach me a lesson. However, I stayed away from his house, at least until his folks got divorced and his dad moved out. And the family's life greatly improved after that, and Mike graduated valedictorian of her class. The man that would marry his mom later was an exact opposite of his father, and became the dad he'd always dreamed of. In the years since my childhood, the attitudes towards domestic violence has improved greatly. I for one can say I'm very pleased to see it. Children living in fear can never be a good or godly way to be. And because of this, I know I can be far more confident that my son and his group of friends will be less likely to find themselves in the same situation that I did.